Welcome to the Industrial IoT Spotlight, your number one spot for insight from industrial IoT thought leaders who are transforming businesses today. With your host, Eric Walenza.
Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Eric Walenza, CEO of IoT One, the consultancy that helps companies create value from data to accelerate growth. And our guest today is Cory O'Daniel, CEO and co-founder at Massdriver. Massdriver helps engineers deploy best practice cloud architectures with integrated observability and security without being a DevOps expert. In this talk, we discuss the evolution of DevOps and cloud computing and why traditional DevOps practices don't work well for many startups today. We also explored the promise of generative AI to aid in DevOps programming and the limits to AI programming that will likely be quite difficult to solve. If you find these conversations valuable, please leave us a comment and a 5-star review. And if you'd like to share your company's story or recommend a speaker, you can email us at team@iot1.com. Finally, if you have an IoT research, strategy, or training initiative that you'd like to discuss, please email me directly at erik.walenza@iot1.com. Thank you. Cory, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, no, this will be an interesting one. You know, I cover a lot of different topics in the podcast. Some of them I'm very comfortable with. Some of them I'm, a little bit outside my comfort zone. I guess this is a little bit outside, so looking forward to getting educated here. But Cory, maybe a good place to start here would be for you to walk us through your quite interesting background and kind of share where you first started getting into the topic of DevOps and the topic of improving productivity for developers.
Yeah. So I've been in the space for a while. My background was originally in healthcare information systems. I was a HIPAA security analyst. And prior to that, I actually wasn't interested in software at all. I'd done a little bit of software development for fun, just like modding games in the 90s. And I wrote some software to do my first job. I automated my own job away, and I got a promotion into the software department, and I changed careers. I was originally a physics major. So got into healthcare IT. I was a HIPAA security analyst for a while. And then I just kind of started falling in love with writing software. And so in 2005, 2006, I moved from Florida to Southern California to join a startup. I had no idea which one. I was just going to do it. And yeah, my first job out here, I was working for a company. They were in a data center. Their lease was expiring and they needed to move. And this was around the same time that Amazon had first launched, I think, EC2. And so my boss came into the office one day and was like, "You've worked in data centers and you write software." Because it was like people that worked on the operations team and there were people who were on the software team. But I was like the one person that kind of sat in between. He's like, "Do you want to help us figure out how to migrate from a data center to these cloud computers that Amazon's selling?" And I was like, none of that makes any sense to me, what you just said. Amazon is selling cloud computers. And so got into, started working in the cloud, worked in some early IAC tools about 11 years ago. And then, the rest is just kind of history, kind of been pigeonholed into the DevOps role for the past 16 years or so.
Yeah. Okay. So you got in actually fairly early, and then at least in the migration to cloud. And then over the past 16 years, I guess DevOps has evolved quite a bit, and it feels like in some ways it's completely evolved. I was chatting with a friend the other day, and he was saying there's some areas where they're just 98% more efficient than they were because there's things you can just automate. And then there's some areas where it feels like hasn't really changed that much. So if you look at the DevOps landscape, where are we at a point where we say, yeah, okay, we're extremely efficient today, and maybe there's incremental improvement to make, but we're already, on a good path. And then where are the areas where you still see a lot of room for improvement in DevOps?
Yeah, so I think honestly, I'm not a fan of DevOps nowadays. I do it, but I think that we have a warped perception of what it is, right? It started out as a culture where it was we can tear down these silos between ops and engineering. And I think that it made sense for a very brief period of time, right? When I was working in early cloud, 2006, 2010, 2011, when there wasn't a ton of cloud services, it made sense, right? We had software, we wanted to introduce change. We needed to get things into the cloud. Like, it made sense for people to kind of own stuff. But like now with the proliferation of what the cloud is, like none of the clouds aim to be simple, right? They aim to be capable, right? They have to be able to sell something to everyone. And in doing that, like with a couple of things have happened. One, the cloud has gotten much more difficult to manage and deploy things in. And at the same time, our software has gotten more complicated, right? We have customers that demand things work as well as Facebook software day one, right? Or they're gone. And we have a global audience when, 10 years ago, you might struggle to get a few thousand people on your website. Like now you can go massive scale pretty quickly, right? And so I think those two things come together to make a world that doesn't really fit DevOps anymore, right? Like, the average software engineer doesn't have any cloud operations experience, right? 8% of software engineers have deep cloud operations experience. So what that means is like when we're doing DevOps, like what are we really doing, right? So if we're getting or if we're getting software developers out of boot camps constantly, they haven't worked in production environments, like operations is production experience. So what are they doing, right? Like they're learning on the job, which is great. Like that's how you learn to do operations, but you can't really have good production systems where people are learning how to run the thing, right? And so I think that, this idea of like everyone does DevOps nowadays doesn't work, and you're seeing it not work, right? That's why you're starting to see DevOps teams, right? You're not seeing DevOps culture. We all do a little bit of DevOps. Like you're starting to see teams where like there's a DevOps role, right? And like that is an antithesis of what DevOps was originally. So it's kind of the industry showing that like this isn't working, right? And what that team is that team's an operations team, right? That's really what it is, right? So like let's call it what it is. Like we do want to tear down these silos, but the way that we're trying to do it, we're saying everybody can go and manage cloud infrastructure. Like that's not the way to do it, right? So like I struggle with like that terminology, but at the same time, like I do DevOps. I'm a software engineer who has deep operational expertise. I write software to automate operations, right? But that's me using software to do something I'm an expert in, right? So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but like it's just I feel like we're not quite there anymore. I think that DevOps idea was a moment in the past, and like we need to evolve past that. We have way too many software developers coming to the industry to try to continue to do that. And if you look at like the functionality of the average platform as a service and the functionality of the cloud, they're massively separate, and there's nothing in between, right? Passes are easy and opinionated. The cloud is complex and unopinionated. And we need to make systems that land somewhere in between so that companies can grow. They don't get cornered into passes, but also engineers can deploy software effectively and securely without having to go become an operations engineer. Sorry, that is soapbox.
That's an interesting perspective. I really hadn't thought about it in that way, but it makes sense, right? That there was a brief period in time when the cloud was kind of simple enough that you could bridge those two divides with, a person that had multiple skill sets, and they would play that role. And now we're at a point where just because of the addition of performance and functionality, the cloud has gotten more complicated. And at the same time, you really have the proliferation of applications, right? So, I'm in the IoT space. So I have so many clients they're industrial companies, they're chemical companies, they're biopharma companies, they're not data science companies, right? And now they're building software that's really essential to their business and their products. And it's driven by people that understand the customer and they understand the market and they're innovators, but they're not, they're not IT people. And so then they have this challenge of how do we put this together into a package that scales with, given the type of organization that we are and the resources that we have. So I think that's kind of the challenge, at least that we see here, is you need to address this, but yeah, maybe the traditional DevOps role doesn't fit well into those organizations, and is maybe not sufficient to solve the challenge there.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw this meme tweet. I don't know, this humorous thing on the internet recently. It was like, time to build feature 1 hour, time to figure out IAM 3 days, and it's like really IAM, like in and of itself, like just configuring permissions of how your applications and people access the cloud is complicated to the fact that we now have IAM engineers. Like that is insane, right? Like that is wild. But like that's where the world is. Like the stuff's complicated. And when you look around at, like the experience base where 8% of engineers have this deep cloud operations experience. And that's from like the Stack Overflow survey. That's not from some weird like Gartner survey picked out. Like that's Stack Overflow, like the heart of like software industry, and says that it's 8 to 10% of people have that skill set, right? And so when you think about that, like where are those people at? They work at Google. They work at AWS, right? They work at Apple. They work at the biggest companies in the world. So when you look around at the rest of us trying to deploy things into the cloud, like a lot of us are just guessing, right? And you're competing salary-wise with some of the biggest companies on the planet, right? If you have the budget for 5 engineers and you need to start deploying stuff to the cloud, how do you do that? Do you go hire an ops person? That's not a great use of your money. It's not a great use of that person's time. Do you take one of your engineers that may not have that experience and say, go figure it out? Okay, well, now your feature velocity is down. Somebody's trying to figure this stuff out. And also, is it configured well? Is it secure? Is it cost efficient? I don't know. You'll figure it out eventually, right? But in the meantime, like your customer's data is in there. My mom's data, our family's data is in there. Like we got to protect this information that we're storing. And I don't think that the way that we approach DevOps today does that, where we're saying like, hey, everybody can do it. It's so simple. And I think it kind of discounts the deep expertise that operations folk actually have by saying anybody can do it.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I mean, again, bringing it back a little bit to the IoT topic, there's legislation going through Congress right now that's basically pushing liability from the device operator to the OEM, right? So, I mean, the status quo up to now has basically been somebody builds a baby monitor or whatever, they put it all on the market, and it's really up to the owner of the device to protect their data. And now they're pushing that liability back and saying, okay, if you're putting a smart device out there, you have to make sure that it adheres to certain security standards. And you can just imagine all these companies that are basically looking at their tech stack and they're saying, okay, how are we going to do this, right? And now we already have a mature tech stack, so it's one thing if you're building from scratch. It's 10x more complicated if you already have a tech stack in place and you're trying to start building that that security into it.
Yeah, and it's funny, like there's this new phrase that I feel like, not new phrase, it's been around a few years, but like I feel like it's a phrase that's just starting to be thrown around all willy-nilly, and it's shift left. We shift operations left. We're shifting security left, right? When you look at ML ops, we're shifting their operations left, right? Like we're shifting a lot of stuff left except for expertise, right? Like to come in and say, okay, DevSecOps, you're writing software, your job is also to secure the software, and your job is also to operate the software. It's okay. Where's your time for developing features, right? And we have this thing on the other side of all the engineering work that we do that like weighs against that security and operations, and that's the product manager, right? Like if you have a product manager at your average, let's say e-commerce company, they don't see your software or your load balancer, serving a ton of traffic quickly. They don't see your database being secure. They see that the button bought more things, right? And it's like their goals are not aligned with the goals of a secure and functional system. Their goals are aligned with conversions, right? And so that's another thing I see. It's hard with like shifting all this accountability left is the rest of the org doesn't really see that for most organizations, right? You might be working at Google and say, well, Google does. It's like, yeah, well, Google does. But the 1,000 t-shirt companies out there, medical device companies don't necessarily see that, right? And if the product managers aren't seeing that work, then what is the engineer doing, right? They only see the work that they can see surface in the product, right? So that's another reason I just think that it's not really serving our industry and all industries well as everything starts to become a software company.
Yeah. Okay. Well, interesting. Tell me then, where does Massdriver fit into this? What's the value proposition of Massdriver, and who's the value proposition for in this relatively complicated chain?
Yeah. So we have kind of two value props depending on the growth stage of your organization. So what we're trying to do is land in between PaaS and the cloud, right? What we're trying to do is make essentially a PaaS that is customizable and can grow with your business. So on the surface, if you come to Massdriver and you're a small team that doesn't have any operations experience, what you see is pretty much a point and click way of building cloud infrastructure. And there's a lot of people that are building this point and click build cloud infrastructure stuff, but the way we do it is a bit different. When you see something in Massdriver, it's very use case oriented. We're not saying grab the 35 components of a network and connect them together to make a network. Like we're thinking about the things you connect from the perspective of a software engineer. I need a network. I need a database. Routing tables, subnets, that stuff doesn't matter. I want it to be secure. I want it to be compliant. We're talking about requirements and policies the engineers want, not necessarily cloud infrastructure details. So that makes it a lot easier to start provisioning secure and compliant things, connecting to your applications, getting them running. Now, where the real magic is as your business grows, as an operations engineer, I've walked into so many companies that were on a pass. They've gotten to the point that they need to move to the cloud. That's an expensive migration. The way Massdriver works is those packages that you're connecting together are actually really just packages. Under the hood, Massdriver is a giant package manager for cloud infrastructure and applications. So when your operations team comes in 4 years from now, instead of them having to migrate you from something, it's already running in your cloud account. So we deploy everything into your AWS, Azure, GCP, on-prem Kubernetes. And now I can take the tools that I'm familiar with, Pulumi, Helm, Terraform. I can customize those packages. And to my engineers, nothing changes. The diagrams that you draw that look just like the stuff you see on a whiteboard is how they provision infrastructure. But I have full control over it as an operations person when the time comes to be able to need to fine-tune infrastructure, add new functionality to the platform.
So how low code is this? Because I guess it's still developers are using this, so they do have a base level of technical competence here. But then I'm also imagining some of my clients where it's basically a product manager and they have an IT team back in Germany, but I'm here in China, and so they're often trying to figure things out on how do I migrate to a cloud in China, with the option of figuring it out themselves or sending it back to the IT pipeline and waiting 3 months until somebody answers the ticket.
Yeah, so it's fairly low code. It can go from no code to as much code as you want. So again, if you go in the Massdriver and you see like one of the boxes, like one of the items you'd see on a whiteboard that you're connecting together, there's an actual source code repository behind that. So you can just go fork that repository and start modifying the way that, let's say, Postgres works or Timescale or EventBridge works behind the scenes. So you can get as deep into the code as you want, or you can just look at it from like a use case perspective. I want Postgres. I want it highly available. I want backups for 7 days. And you're looking at it very much from like the attributes of what you need from the cloud. Now, when you're deploying your applications, it gets to the codey parts as it gets closer to your code. So like when you get to your application, connecting to that database, then you might see code for the first time, but that's in your source repository. So you're saying like, where do you want to mount that environment variable, right? So it's extremely low code. Our customers generally don't see Terraform or YAML or any of that stuff if they don't want to. On the other side, if you're a deep operations team, if you're an operations team with deep expertise, like you can fine tune the thing. You can literally add functionality to it. You can extend the runtimes the application or the platform supports. Customers can add their own clouds to it. So, if you want to run OVH or Scaleway, you can just add that to your silo, and now Massdriver supports that cloud as well. So it's got a pretty wide range depending on where your expertise level and comfort level is.
Gotcha. Okay. And then who would you be working with typically? I mean, I understand it's tech companies. What's the right size or maturity level? Are there specific industries where you've seen more traction in the market?
Yeah. So we're a pretty early stage startup, right? So we're about to start our next round. This will be our first series. So pretty early stage still. So we're mostly focusing on startups and people that are about our age as well, right? So pre-series A. That's what's been the easiest for us to sell to and migrate onto the platform. Now, that being said, it's really funny because companies get big quickly nowadays. So we've got some startups where it's like, okay, there's 3 or 4 people there. And then we start looking at their traffic profiles and it's 8 million requests an hour. And it's like, okay, it's a small team, but they're already serving a ton of traffic, right? We have another company that's moving onto the platform and they're trying to figure out how to migrate 20 terabytes of data onto Massdriver from this old environment they manage themselves, right? So they're pretty small teams with pretty big scale already. And then on the other side, we've got a few enterprises. We have one of the big 3 consulting firms is using it for a small project. So it's a pretty wide range of industries that are using it. But the companies that we see the most are healthcare. Again, because we do a lot of the compliance scanning out of the box. So SOC 2, PCI, HIPAA, we do on all this infrastructure by default. So it can get you really close to compliance at the infrastructure level. You kind of got to focus on your apps. And then the other place that we're really seeing a ton of interest is machine learning and AI, right? I mean, we're at, the 4th gold rush of Silicon Valley with ML and AI. And we're selling shovels, right? Like, I mean, we want to do some of our own ML and AI stuff, but like today, it's like when you look at a lot of teams and you go into companies where you see there's like this transactional product that makes the money, and then there's the ML team, like more often than not, the ML teams don't have a ton of operational support and they're figuring out this stuff themselves, right? And so we have companies coming to us today that they want to run this ML product, they're doing model training, but they don't know how to do the operation stuff. They got something running locally, on their machine, and they need to figure out how to get it into the cloud. And then we even have a pass that is a pretty early stage pass that is for the ML space that's building their pass on top of Massdriver. So we're actually seeing this full promise that we were hoping to be able to deliver, that you could even run systems as complicated as passes on top of the platform that we built.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit of a deviation, but I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on this topic of GPT or generative AI, because it feels like it's really democratized kind of access to machine learning in a way that really wasn't. I mean, 2 years ago, you needed some data scientists and a fair bit of investment to get something off the ground. And now you kind of need an idea and a reasonably competent developer, and you can start building an application. But then, yeah, like you said, those applications can start to scale, and you're starting to deal with maybe high volumes of data, high user bases, et cetera. But how do you see that kind of democratization of access to AI evolving right now?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really interesting. I think it's super exciting. I've definitely played around with ChatGPT and Jasper and a few other ones, especially in the areas that I'm weak in, right? So, I'm a tech CEO, but like this is my first time CEOing. I don't have a ton of marketing experience, so I've been leaning on Jasper and ChatGPT to like rewrite some of my copy, right? And what's funny is like I'm like, oh, that sounds pretty good, and then I read it and I'm like, that doesn't really sound really good. Like it was nice and wordy, right? But like, it's not a really great marketing hook, right? And so I think there's a lot of novelty to it. But like I was thinking about this maybe like a month or so back when people were freaking out about, before ChatGPT, there was the image one, and artists were like, oh, they're going to take art from us. Like, there's not going to be art anymore. It's like, the thing can't draw hands, right? Like it can draw all sorts of weird stuff, but it can't make a human hand, right? And then the same panic started happening, I feel like, when ChatGPT came out. It's like, oh, what are writers going to do? There's not going to be writers anymore. And it's like, okay, yeah, if you're the writer that's writing the 7 paragraphs before a recipe about somebody's grandma on a recipe site, yeah, that person's out of a job. But like when you talk about like authors and people that make movies, I feel like a lot of the human experience is, especially in writing, is exposure and experience, right? Like, and what's interesting is like, take a good writer, they've had this exposure to writing, they've read some books, right? They've had some exposure to education, and they've had the experience of their life. And those two things craft their existence, right? That lets them write well. And when you look at ChatGPT, it has 0 experience and 100% exposure, right? And so what you get down is these like watered down ideas of what humans do, right? I mean, it's like ChatGPT is a brain in a skin suit, right? It's like, right? It's like, it's not quite human. It doesn't feel really human, right? And so when I worry about a bit when it comes to it in software, like we've already seen the weird stuff with, what's the GitHub one, Copilot, Autopilot, whatever it's called. Like it does some weird in comment sometimes, right? And it's trained off of the stuff we put out there. And so it's trained off of open source, right? When you start looking at infrastructure, it's like, what is it to train off of, right? I admit a lot of what we do is commodity as operations engineers, but the stuff that you see out in the public isn't great. So let's say that you train it on, let's say you train it on the AWS docs. They're hard to follow. Like I feel like I'm reading a white paper most of the time that I'm configuring something, reading it over and over and over again. And there's all sorts of these rules everywhere. It's like, if you selected this, then you can't do this, and you got to set IOPS for this, and yada, yada, yada. It's very hard to follow. I don't know that AI is going to get that. What's worse is when you start looking at a lot of the IAC that we do, let's say that we're writing Terraform to automate some of our infrastructure. Terraform is an abstraction on top of the cloud's APIs. And then there's this open source registry where you can share these modules, right? And this is a lot of the stuff under the hood of how Massdriver works. We have these modules as well. But when you go to the Terraform registry, what they are is a bunch of organizations, say 1,000 companies, all sharing this same module, all of them putting their opinions on it. And so you get to the point that there's literally no expertise in it whatsoever, right? So you go look at, let's say, the Terraform module for making a network. It is a re-implementation of the underlying Terraform code, which is a re-implementation of the API that it's calling. And when you look at something like a VPC on the Terraform registry, there's 180 inputs. When you look at the API for AWS, there's like 20 inputs to what a network is, right? And so like we have massively overcomplicated it by having everyone's bespoke opinion of how their organization works on something that is a commodity, right? That is what ChatGPT is going to be trained off of. It's going to learn the watered down experience of all operations, how all companies are trying to do it, which is just the most vague configuration there is. That's 180 inputs for a VPC. Like, how do you even design a good VPC that way, right? And so without expertise actually being baked into the things that it's being trained on, it's just going to learn what the APIs look like. It's not going to learn how to configure them well. It's not going to learn what SOC 2 is or isn't, right? It's just going to learn that, oh, I can hit this API with some numbers and letters and it'll respond 200 okay. So I'm not worried. We've been worried. I feel like every decade we're worried about something that's going to take the software away from software engineers and something's going to replace us. And I don't think we're there yet. Like, will it happen by 2400? Maybe. But like, a decade ago, we were worried about Dreamweaver. A decade before that, they were worried about, like Fortran or something like that. We're always worried about something coming along and like making it so easy that everybody else can do it. And I don't think ChatGPT is going to be the thing to take away the jobs of operations engineers.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting perspective. I was listening to a podcast the other day where somebody was describing DALL-E and what it's good at and what it's not good at. And what it's good at is if you go to an art gallery and you see the text that they use to describe a picture, they might say this is a Renaissance painting from this time period, and they'll describe it in a certain way. But they don't say the woman is to the left of the man, the sun is on the top right of the picture. And so what humans do is they go and say, I want you to do a picture with two people. The woman is on the left of the man. The sun is on the top left. And DALL-E is like, I have no idea what to do with this because I've never seen a picture with alt text that describes it in that way. But if you go and say, hey, I want a Renaissance picture of da-da-da, it'll kind of figure it out because it's seen a bunch of examples with alt text. So there's certain things that it's good at. I mean, we're working on a little side project right now where we're basically using the API to summarize a bunch of regulations, right? So just look through the regulation, find keywords, and summarize it in a reasonable way. And that works because it's doing a very narrow part of a process that's very tightly defined with text that we're giving it. We're basically just feeding it 20,000 documents and saying, this is the text you're going to work with. And that's kind of where I feel like it fits in right now. So probably with software engineering, it'll be the same thing. There will be some specific jobs that will do very well, but then the whole flow of the operations has a lot of complexity. There's a certain art to it, and yeah, we'll see if it ever gets there. But it seems like we still have a ways to go at this point.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting too. Like, I mean, especially if we're seeing the code, right? It's one thing if it's writing code and doing the stuff for us, right? Like, can an AI model just be my CMS, or is it going to generate code that I have to then run, right? If it's generating code that I have to now run, like all code that we write is mostly read by humans, right? It's like we write some code, but then it's our teammates reading it, right? So then the question is like, okay, it can write code that compiles. Can it write code that's efficient? And then can it write code that is human readable, right? Because what we don't want is, okay, it wrote the code in 20 seconds, but it took 24 hours to debug a production bug where there was an outage because we couldn't comprehend what it output, right? And so like that's the real worry is like what is good code, right? It's like I feel like there's just tropes left and right on Twitter like that we're not even good at writing code. Everybody always has imposter syndrome and says like, oh, I'm not great at it. We're all just guessing anyway. It's like, okay, so we're going to train the thing off an industry of millions of people just guessing. That's great.
Right. Cool. Well, okay. So a little deviation, but let's come back to the product now. So if we look at Massdriver, the way you described it on your website is kind of three different, I don't know if we call these modules or capabilities, but it's design, connect, observe. Can you just walk me through what are the three big jobs to be done here?
Yeah, so we're actually in the process of making some changes. So by the time this comes out, it might be shifted a bit. So the original idea, and this was mind-blowing to us. Again, this was built by an operations team, right? So it's like all three of the co-founders have worked in the operations space for a number of years. So when we started working on this, our idea was that people don't necessarily enjoy doing the cloud operations bits. Like a lot of the people that I've worked with where I was an operations person, they're on the dev team, right? Like they didn't like doing DevOps, or they didn't want to do like the DevOpsy stuff, right? And so my bias was always, oh, people aren't excited by it. People don't want to do it. It's a little complicated. And what we've started to see is there's just not a ton of people that have experience with it, right? There's like this local bias of like, oh, I know operations engineers. Everybody knows how to work in the cloud. But like when you get out into the greater audience of software engineers, people coming out of boot camps, people coming out of colleges, nobody teaches production there. Nobody teaches how to run our software. They teach you how to write the software. Writing it alone is difficult to teach, right? And so when we built this originally, it was like, okay, it was very high level. And it's like, hey, you can connect all these things. And what we started to see is like our customers were coming in and they were like, we start with the network. And it's like, okay, I don't remember how CIDR ranges work. I don't remember how subnets work. And so we actually started out as a product that was very easy to prototype stuff if you knew what you were doing. And so we've started to move away from that a bit. So what's going to be out probably by the time this goes live is we're shifting the perspective to focus from your application side. And then you can tell us what you need. So my application needs an event bus, it needs Postgres, and then we can generate the infrastructure for you. So we still very much have that design phase, but we're designing from the point of view of the application now rather than the network up. So today you go and you add a network, you add a cluster, you connect it, you add a database, you put it on your network, you add an app and you connect it to your cluster in your database and it's running, right? Literally our sales guy can get Kubernetes, Postgres, and Redis up with an application running on with load balancers in like 10 minutes. And 7 of those minutes are Postgres deploying. So that is the design phase. Connect is just literally connecting it. And connecting is actually our intellectual property. So again, when you see the canvas, there's boxes, which are the actual like pieces of infrastructure, and then there's the lines in between it. So the boxes are just IAC. That's actual real code written by somebody who's an expert in that. They publish it into our package manager. When you drag it on, it provisions it. You can write your own packages as well. Where the magic happens is the lines. So when you connect the boxes together, each box we have a cloud type system that describes the cloud and use cases and how things function in the cloud. And so when you drag one of these boxes on, whether you write it yourself or whether it's one that's written by Massdriver, you say what the type is that comes out of it, right? So you might have Postgres. That is a type. That's something you're looking for. That's a very use case oriented type in Massdriver. But if you're on AWS, it might be RDS with 15 replicas and some router rules and some IAM. If you're on GCP, it might be Cloud SQL with 3 instances. Like what's inside the box doesn't matter to you as a software developer, so long as you're getting highly available Postgres, right? So we have this type system, and then the lines are a directed graph. So we know what you deployed, whether we wrote that package or not, and we know the dependency direction. And so we use that to do things like automate IAM. So you get principal of least privilege with Massdriver with no effort. We can see that your application is using S3. We can see that you've said you're writing to S3. We'll generate an IAM role for your application. We'll generate just enough policy for you to be able to write to that bucket. If you say that you read and write to the bucket, we'll generate enough policy for you to read and write to the bucket. Similarly, if you draw a line from an application to a Kubernetes cluster, it configures your continuous delivery. Again, behind these boxes is all the code in the world if you want it. So it's like you get continuous delivery out of the box by drawing a line. If you say, it doesn't work the way I want to do some more interesting A/B stuff, then you can fork the bundle and modify how the A/B rules work and the rollout rules work for your continuous delivery. When you draw a line from a database to an application, it injects the database credentials directly into the runtime, the environment variables of your application. That's where you actually hit code for the first time when you're using Massdriver. You're saying how to route those connections into your application's environment. But the cool thing is, like, if you really just want Postgres, you drag Postgres on, you connect your app to it, deploy it, and you're getting something that's been SOC 2 scanned, HIPAA scanned, PCI scanned. If it's on a cloud, it's done the cloud's security scanning on it. IAM's automated with principal of least privilege. Security, like credentials, the only place they exist are in your application's runtime. They're not, you don't have to go set up HashiCorp Vault, you don't have to set up secrets manager, you don't have to put something in LastPass. It's directly injected into the runtime of your app. So that's the real magic. That's the connecting part. And then the observe is, it's not quite a platform if you can't tell what's going on in it, right? And so we have automated monitors and alerting by default. So we have an alerting system similar to PagerDuty. If something breaks, you get an alert in your email. You click the link. Instead of going to Datadog where you're looking at a bunch of logs trying to figure out what in the hell is going on, we take you back to the diagram, highlight the piece of infrastructure that's experiencing the issue, and your alerts are right there. We just rolled out automated metrics as well. So now your metrics for all of your cloud stuff streams back in real time. So your diagram is now your dashboard where you configure infrastructure, and it's where you're able to get alerts. So you can see the full system of your health, full health of your system, and address any issues right from the platform.
Gotcha. And then on your website, you also go into a little bit of detail, probably more on the Connect side. So you have this, maybe this will change by the time you have the next update out anyways, but 4 supported platforms. So that's AWS, GCP, Azure, and Kubernetes. 7 supported data stores, Postgres, MongoDB, etc. And then this 58 production-ready best practice bundles. And I guess the platform's pretty intuitive. The data stores likewise. The production-ready best practice bundles, what does that entail?
Yeah, so everything in Massdriver is a bundle. So your app, like if you deploy your application in Massdriver, it becomes a bundle. And so what we do is we take anything that gets deployed, we package the IAC around it, or the infrastructure as code around it, right? So even if you're running a Docker container in Kubernetes, there's still some cloud IAC to it. Like your application needs a role, at least, right? And it may need some other resources as well, like service accounts, etc. So everything in Massdriver is a bundle. So all the boxes that you see on the canvas that you're connecting together are bundles. And so databases are bundles. So you can add new database support. I think we have like 7 databases that are in Massdriver by default. I think there's probably like 13 variants total. So there's like RDS, there's serverless Postgres, MySQL, etc. The rest of the bundles are things like queues, API gateways, Lambdas, networks, machine learning workspaces. So it's pretty much all of the high level concepts you think about in the cloud. So again, we're very use case oriented. So we have a network. We don't have subnets and router table modules. We have a module that kind of describes the entire idea of a network in as few parameters as possible.
Okay, I'm curious your thought process for how to grow this. I guess there's a couple things that I've seen, platforms that are maybe more application oriented than yours, but in some cases they identify customers who are a bit more tech savvy and are basically building out what you're calling a bundle. So they might build out a new bundle that you don't have in place, and they'll kind of customize it for a particular situation. And then in some cases, companies are kind of bringing that in and kind of repackaging their customers' work as product. In some cases, they're also allowing their customers to monetize that and say, I've created a new extension almost of the platform. I'm not sure if that makes sense here. I mean, I'm reflecting more on like industry vertical, where they might be building something for like quality detection on a platform and then saying, I want to add that as a new module on the platform. And then the other, I guess the other approach is you wait for customers to come out and, send a request and say, hey, can you help us with this? And you kind of grow organically in that way. But what's the path? Because I guess you have 58 today. I'm sure this is going up kind of week by week. So what's the model there?
We have a couple. As far as growth for like adding more functionality, right? So we have effectively 2 work streams. So we have the platform, which is all of the functionality and the UI and the CLI. And that's an important note, is we have our CLI as well. So we're API first. We're not one of these sites like you can do everything on the website. That's it. It's actually a GraphQL API behind the scenes. So anything you see in the UI, you can actually do more in the GraphQL API. We ship Graph first. But you can also do GitOps, right? So like there's some teams that like doing GitOps. You can do GitOps with Massdriver. You just, you happen to get this sweet diagram as a part of your GitOps model. So as far as how we add more bundles, that second work stream is bundle development. So we build them in a couple of ways. So when we first made Massdriver, there were no bundles. And so we came to our first customer, like, look at this platform. It's like you write some Terraform or Helm, you publish it in the platform. It's kind of like Terraform Cloud, except for you can visualize the thing and it does all these security practices for you. And our customers were like, we don't know how to build cloud infrastructure, so we're not going to write Terraform. And we're like, what do you mean you don't know how to, right? Like one of our first customers, like he was like, I don't know what the F a CIDR range is. And he's the CTO of a very large company. And it was just like, okay, like, so people really don't necessarily have this expertise to even start using the platform. So we started building these bundles so people had a starting point. And so what's funny is we actually had a bunch of these bundles built because we use Massdriver to run Massdriver. So we essentially just took all of our private bundles that we were running our software with and we published them first. And what's nice is like, we went through all this security scanning, all this compliance scanning, all this effort to make them best practice follow reference architectures because we're all paranoid ops people that are working on the platform. So all of a sudden we had all this functionality and customers were like, oh, this is great. I can run a Kubernetes cluster in like 5 minutes in my Postgres and I can just attach my apps to it and it's running. It's like, oh, people want the bundle functionality, right? So we started leaning into that. So we actually spend one day a week, every Friday, everyone on the team starts working on bundles. So it's like Bundle Dev Friday. So we do Bundle Dev-ish Friday. So we actually are big fans of the idea of 4-day work weeks. So we're down to 4.5 days right now. So half day Fridays we work on bundles. And there's two goals in that. One is just to get more functionality in the platform. Like I would love it, and actually I do love it when somebody comes to the platform and they can build exactly what they need and they don't have to think about ops. That's great. That's great. That is exactly what we want to deliver to that person. They get to focus on their software. They get to focus on shipping customer value. When they're ready for an operations team, their operations team is going to be super excited that they've got compliance, security, Terraform, and it's running in their cloud instead of being trapped in a PaaS. The other thing that we do with building bundles is make sure that the experience is good, right? So it's like we can go to the UI and connect things all day long and see, oh, the UI works great. Like it's really nice to be able to draw stuff. But I know at some point in time, there's going to be operations people working on these bundles for their engineering teams. I want to make sure that that developer experience for operations is as great as the user experience for their developers in the UI. So the other thing we're doing with the bundle development is just constantly trying to make it easier to build stuff, right? So we've got some tools now that can take Terraform modules from the Terraform registry, automatically generate a Massdriver bundle from it, and publish it into the platform, right? So if you have existing Terraform and you want to run it in Massdriver, you can run this tool and it'll package it up. Now, why do we do that? Because the Massdriver bundle is your IAC tool, plus it is rich validation and UI. So you can actually even control the user interface of Massdriver. So you can make enums, you can add rules to make sure people are entering valid values, et cetera. So, that's kind of the two ways that we grow those now. We also have enterprise customers that come on and sometimes they're like, okay, as a part of coming on, like we need this functionality and you don't have a bundle for it today. So we'll prioritize building something like that. So that's where a lot of our actual Azure stuff came from. We had a customer come along and like, we run on Azure. And so we're like, okay, well, we'll build a bunch of Azure modules. And like, it's going to take you forever. We did it in a week. So it just kind of goes to show like how easy it is to extend the platform.
Yeah, and since you brought up what is this Bundle Friday and your 4.5 day work week, I'm curious about this. I mean, when I look at your the About Us page on your website, you really get the feeling that the people here enjoy working there, right? And that you have kind of a culture around that. I mean, we're trying to figure this out at our company as well, right? I'm also of the feeling that consulting has a reputation as being kind of a terrible work-life balance. Get young people and work them until they bleed, and then they move on to something where they can actually have a decent life. And in IT, I guess traditionally you also had this kind of 996 lifestyle. I think for a lot of people that doesn't work anymore, but you still have a kind of a high pressure environment, high performance environment. So how do you manage that as a tech company, kind of managing work-life balance with your team?
Yeah, I mean, so there's definitely points in time where people work more than 4.5 days, right? I mean, like when and I think that is something that you can lean into when you have a really good work-life balance. Like when people are stoked about coming to work, like if they have to work a late night, it's not as exhausting anymore, right? But one of the ways that we kind of work around making sure something like that doesn't happen is, we're like very vocal about getting the fuck offline. So it's just like one of the guys on my team, if he hears this, I think he's going to know exactly who I'm talking about. Like I see him on at like 7 p.m. sometimes. I'm like, why are you online? Like go hang out with your family. Like get off of the site. Like go do something, right? And so we encourage people to leave at the end of their day. One, but two, I think the way that we approach work is very different as well. So we follow Basecamp's Shape Up. So we don't do things like, hey, how many points is this ticket? Is it 5 or is it 7? Is it medium? Is it large? Like you have a deadline. Instead, what we do is we have an idea of what we want to put into the product. And me and my co-founder come up with like how much days worth of effort it's worth. So what we say is like, hey, this is worth 3 days of your time. Like spend 3 days working on it. And at the end of 3 days, if it looks good, we'll put it in prod. If not, we'll try to determine like how much more time we think it's going to take and if it's worth that much more effort, right? So like the incentives there are a bit more aligned. Instead of saying like, hey, it's 7 points, you have to have it done by Friday. It's like, none of that even makes sense. But if I tell you, hey, like this is worth 3 days of effort, and like let's see if we get it in, like it kind of shifts like the way we do our work. And I don't know, we ship fast. It's really funny. Like as a CEO and as somebody who's like building a product, I occasionally feel like we're moving so slow. Like I feel like it's glacial sometimes. But it's funny. It's like a year and 2 months ago, you couldn't delete infrastructure in Massdriver. There was no sidebars. There were no public bundles. You had to write your own. And in less than a year, we've built an alerting system. We've built an automated metrics ingestion system. We've built an IAC agnostic provisioning engine. We built the platform itself. We've built our package manager, which is IAC agnostic. So like when you see like the amount of stuff that we built in a year, it's kind of mind blowing that we've shipped this much stuff because it's like we've got like 6 businesses worth of software in our one product, right? And so I think it's just giving that people that time to actually have that freedom. When they show up on Monday morning, they're stoked because they had 2.5 days off, right? Like it's not like they were working till 6 p.m. on a Saturday and they haven't seen their families, right? So I really think that just being excited about the work you do rather than doing some work is what makes the big difference there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, you can get a tremendous amount done if you're motivated and working with people you enjoy working with, and you can waste a tremendous amount of time if you're exhausted, your mind's not quite working, and you feel like you just gotta fill up the hours, or you have to participate in every meeting because that's how you get face time. And so, it makes sense. Last thing I wanted to touch on here, Cory, maybe there's a couple other things you wanted to share, but last thing I had on the agenda here was your pricing. I always think it's interesting to understand the logic behind a company's pricing model. And yours seems pretty direct, right? So it looks like it's a percentage of monthly cloud spend and somewhere between like 10, 20%, something like this. But how do you maybe first you can describe what it actually is, but then I'm interested in your thought process of how you selected that pricing model.
Yeah. So right now our pricing is 30% of your managed cloud spend. So stuff that Massdriver is managing after your first $500 a month. So the goal is I want the platform to be accessible and free to anybody that doesn't have a large cloud spend. So if your cloud spend is less than $500 a month, Massdriver is always free, right? The thing that really sucks about what we're doing is like, I can never truly give you a free hosting experience, right? Heroku can do that. Or actually, Heroku can't. They're taking it away from you, right? But like some people can actually give you the compute for free. We can't because we run in your cloud account. So there is a base cost to running on Massdriver because you're going to have to pay AWS or GCP or Azure, right? And so I want people to be able to learn about the cloud, and it's hard to do that, right? It's hard to go run something on AWS if you've never done it before. What I don't want to do is say you have to pay for AWS and you have to pay for some Massdriver. So we have that cap on there. It's like if it's less than $500, you'd never get a bill for Massdriver. After that, it's 30 cents or 30% per dollar. So if your bill's $501 a month to your cloud account, your Massdriver bill is 30 cents. And so the goal there is like, that scales pretty well, right? If you get up to, let's say, $10,000 a month of cloud spend, it's a $3,000 Massdriver bill, right? So like, how does that play out? It's like, okay, it's cheaper than an operations person, right? So you're still at that point where if you look at $3,000 a month, that's $36,000 a year. If you go hire an ops person in the US, you're talking 150, 180, like just salary before benefits, before all the business stuff, right? And then to be able to get full utilization out of somebody with that deep expertise and even find that person that they know Mongo, they know RDS, they know your language, like they know everything about your stack, it's going to be very hard to find. And so if we can help you get to the point where you're able to ship software without bringing in this expensive person that has this deep expertise that you're not ready for yet, like that's a benefit. And so really what we see is most people, like they'll hit that, we have that slider go up to 10,000, right? That's usually around the time where people ask us for fixed pricing. So we're pretty cool about getting people in. Like, fixed pricing looks better for us. If I go to my VCs and I say that I've got ARR instead of monthly billings, like it looks great. So like we want to get people in the fixed pricing. So if there's concern about the 30%, we're pretty quick to like find a percent that works and lock people in. And that works for most of our customers, and everybody else is kind of sitting in that usage-based consumption range.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. Good, Cory. Anything else that we haven't touched on yet that's important for folks to understand?
Yeah, I mean, about the platform, I think we went into a lot of it. Honestly, like I'm really just interested in more people getting like deep expertise for the cloud. Like I wrote an article recently. If you search for elephant in the cloud, it's on the Microsoft blog. So I was invited to write a thought piece on the future of the cloud. And it's kind of just about like this existential dread I have, right? Like we are building or not building, we're making a lot of software engineers. Like we're printing them. Like there's 5 times, like the growth rate of the software engineering role is 5 times any other job in the United States. We're making 5 times more software engineers than we're making doctors. We're making more software engineers, less lawyers. Some people might say it's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know. Jury's out on that one. But like we're making a lot more software engineers, and we're not making as many doctors and all these expertise or all these experts anymore, right? And so the problem with this is like now you start to look like 5 years from now, it's like a good portion of our industry has only 5 years of experience, only has 2 years of experience, right? Like we're just constantly making more and more engineers. We have a lot of people without this production experience, a lot of people without deep experience. And so what kind of worries me is where this ends up, right? What is it? 60, 70 years ago, there was one software engineer, and now there's like more software engineers than there is the population of Australia. Like that's nuts. There's way more software engineers than almost any other job on the planet, right? And so when you think like the year's 2050, we do have AI, and maybe it's helping doctors do surgery. Great. The person that wrote that software went to school for 12 weeks and came out of a boot camp, but that doctor went to school for 8 years and did a residency, right? And so it's like, it's really funny to think about like professionalism and software development. Like we're an industry of hobbyists, and like we very much have grown this way, right? And we very much approach our jobs this way, but like we're getting to the point where every single industry on the planet is a software company. And I think that we need to start approaching software with a bit more professionalism, right? Like I would love to see if in 2050 there's actual medical, like software engineering, like career paths, like that is great, right? Like let people get some of that expertise. And I think we need the same thing for operations, right? Somebody has to operate these systems, and we're not doing enough training and education in that. And so I would love to talk about it. If anybody wants to hit me up on Twitter and like talk about like how we get more people operational expertise, like we don't have enough, and everybody has to run their software someplace. So that's something that worries me. So hit me up if you want to talk about it, because I would love to find a solution.
Yeah, awesome. Well, folks, that is massdriver.cloud. And Cory, thanks for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at IoT1HQ and to check out our database of case studies on IoT1.com. If you have unique insight or a project deployment story to share, we'd love to feature you on a future edition. Write us at eric.walenza@IoT1.com.